Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for coming back with us here at Cold Case Christianity. I am J. Warner Wallace. As you know, we have been traveling through Season 5. If this is being played in the same season in which you're watching, it depends on how many times you watch our show and if you've been watching it over the last 5 years or not. But we are in the middle of a season in which we are taking a look at quick shot responses. Quick shot responses to the most popular or common objections that are offered conversationally. And you discover these sometimes by just, you have your own conversations. If I asked you, what are the barriers that you think you encounter in conversations that you have with people, barriers to faith? We do this a lot with young people, right? We ask Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, boomers, everyone's got a different set of barriers. Questions that maybe in their era, their generation, became the obstacles for people to believe something as crazy as Christianity would be true. And it varies. Even generationally, I see that it varies. And if you're somebody who says, well, I couldn't even make a list like that because I don't really encounter that many, it's probably because you're not sharing the gospel much. You're not sharing the truth of Christianity much. Because if you are, you will encounter some pushback. And I look at it in terms of, well, I have a lot of conversations because I'm constantly speaking about this publicly. That's different. I also have a large media platform, well, not large, but large enough where I get people who write to me with objections, so I get it there too. But if I just wanted to research it in terms of, you could search for it. You could even say, hey, what are the most common objections to Christianity? Search for it online. I think the best ones are the ones that you encounter organically, right? You encounter them because you got someone in your life that you love, and this is their thing. This is the thing that keeps them from believing. And I'm always amazed at the number of ways that someone can deny the claims of Christianity. I don't mean to say it's silly. There's so many ways you can. No, I mean there are really a number of different ways. There are a number of different things that have to be true, for example, in order for Christianity to be true. If I just undermine any one of those things, I can destroy the case for Christianity. And what we're going to do today is talk about one such issue that I think can do this. It can undermine the claims of Christianity, and I love it because it's not one of the more what come to mind right away. It's not as common as some of the other ones, but I encounter it all the time on Twitter for some reason. I don't know why that platform seems to I get a lot of the same question over and over again, and in comments underneath posts. But I want to share it with you. By the way, we are posting all of this material both on our website at coldcasechristianity.com, and you'll see the tab there for the phone app. And that's where we have these quick shots designed so that you can access them in real time while you're in conversations and be able to overcome objections. Now, what I want to do today is talk about, I think, it's one of many different angles you could come at Christianity that would undermine it as a worldview. Let me just put it on the screen for you. Here's the idea. Simple. I don't care about Christianity because I don't believe there's any such thing as sin. I don't believe in the idea, the concept of sin. And so therefore, I have no interest in Christianity. Now, you might think, well, that's kind of an interesting way to kind of defeat Christianity, but it would, wouldn't it? Think about it. What Christianity does is it offers a cure for a problem that's killing all of us, that's separating all of us from God. It's a cure for what ails us spiritually. But if we're not really ailing spiritually, if we don't really have that problem, then the cure has got no value. So one way to undermine the impact of the cure is to simply deny the disease, deny the illness. And since what Jesus did on that cross is he died to pay the penalty for our sin, one way to negate Jesus is simply to negate sin. If there is no sin, then I don't care what Jesus did on there. That's a ridiculous idea because there's no sin that he can pay a penalty for. I don't believe in sin. Okay. I don't think a lot of us, I mean, even if you've been listening to apologetics for a while, or Christian case making, and you've been listening to shows like ours, and NRB TV is a great place to catch all of the apologists who are nationally doing the work in the Christian worldview, philosophers, thinkers, who are trying to respond to these objections. I bet this is not one you hear much, but it's still a deal killer for Christianity. And we need to be ready to answer that question, because for some reason, and I can see why, in a culture in which everything goes, and people are rejecting the moral teaching of Jesus of Nazareth at an increasing rate, what really is left that you would identify as wrongdoing? I mean, there are still some things, right? But if you're not murdering people, stealing from people, you're like I was before I became a Christian. And before I became a Christian, I would have told you were crazy if you called me a sinner. I'm not a sinner. I'm the guy who takes sinners to jail. So we have to at least help people to see that sin does exist. And what does that mean for the Christian worldview? Let me give you the first way I would respond to this claim that there is no sin. It's a very simple way that really just trades on the definition of the word. I'll put it on the screen for you. Okay. Well, let me just talk about what sin is, okay? Because the Old and New Testament concepts of sin, I know that's what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, this is a biblical idea, sin. Well, those are words, okay? That notion is derived from a Greek and a Hebrew word, words actually, that describe really the idea of missing the mark, or better maybe to say missing the center of a target. Like back in those days, if you were throwing spears or you were shooting arrows in archery. In other words, if the goal of the contest is to hit the bullseye, right, and the target, then any effort that misses the bullseye, that falls short of that goal, would be described with one of these words as sin. Now, think about it. If there were no bullseyes, there could be no misses, right? If in just hitting the target at all, anywhere, would count the same. Now, to say there's no such thing as sin, right? If you're going to say that there's no such thing as sin, really what you're saying is there's no such thing as a bullseye. Really? Are you sure you want to do that? I mean, are you willing to do that? Do you think we could really, as a culture, as a species, survive or live or thrive if we live without any bullseyes? You know, any moral codes, any standard, any ethical standard? Do you think how do you think we would, interact with each other? What if we don't have a bullseye, a high level, a high value that you hold for behavior? When you have that high value, you have one in mind. You have a bullseye in mind in any number of areas. Are you really willing to eliminate all bullseyes? All the bullseyes that really regulate how we interact with each other? I just want in this first response to help people see the cost of such an idea. Even if you don't believe that sin has a penalty, or that sin has the penalty described in Scripture, the idea that you want to eliminate the notion of sin means you really are eliminating the notion of the bullseye. And I think that's a scary proposition. And I don't think most people want to do that. But if you want to admit or to embrace or to encourage a specific standard, and it can be different for everyone, fine, but that means you've got a bullseye. And that means anything that's missing the mark is, by its definition, what we talk about biblically as sin. So I don't think you want to do that, do you? That's a way to kind of approach it based on the definition. Let's take a break. When we come back from the break, I want to give you another way to respond to this, which is slightly more nuanced. We'll take that break, and I'll come back and I'll give you response number 2.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
Jim, talk to us a little bit how our existence as conscious creatures point to the existence of God.
Here's the problem. If we know we have a conscious experience, and we usually associate that with our mental processing in our brain. But if atheism is true, we're living in a material universe, which means we're living in a physical universe, only made up of space, time, and matter, laws of physics, laws of chemistry. Can these kinds of things produce a non-material consciousness? We certainly can produce a material brain, but is the brain the same as the conscious mind? I think there are many reasons to think this is not the case, that the consciousness is not identical to brain. And there's a number of ways of kind of parsing that out, but there's the most important thing. If we have consciousness, non-material consciousness, which is why philosophers, material kind of naturalist philosophers, call this the problem of mind to begin with. It's because it's hard to explain how mind could exist if what we really have is nothing more than a material brain. This is this mind-body dualism problem that everyone talks about. So either we have to reject consciousness altogether as an illusion, and many committed atheists, or at least consistent in their worldview, they do reject consciousness. But then, of course, we experience consciousness. Or you have to redefine it in some way that really stretches the imagination outside of what our practical experience of consciousness is. Or you have to ask yourself, well, if I can't get immaterial, non-material consciousness from inside this material box we call the universe, what if the thing that's given us this is a non-material mind outside the realm of consciousness that creates in its image? Well, that might explain why we are conscious creatures, but it's an explanation that forces us outside of naturalism to find an answer. And that's why I do think that the best explanation for consciousness is a reflection, a product of a conscious creator who creates in his image.
Okay, what I want to do here is really talk about where I think most people think about when they think about sin. Some are just going to look at it as a neutral concept of right or wrong, but others really see the connection between the term, because it's so biblical, right, and God. And so I want to talk that and kind of flesh that out a little bit, the nuanced difference, right? So, because I think most people would say, well, I believe in wrongdoing, or maybe even a standard, but sin, that's the thing that offends God. If there's no God, there could be no sin, because sin is just something that offends God. So I want to be able to talk about that distinction, and that's why this response is slightly different. Let's take a look at it on the screen. Okay, so just you mentioned that there's no sin. Well, what do you mean by this word you're using, sin? I think most of us recognize that crimes exist, right? The existence of crimes. I mean, even if we deny the existence of sins, maybe you don't like that word or that concept, I think we both agree that there are crimes that occur. Now, how do I define these two terms? How would you define the two terms? Well, okay, for some, I think they would say that crimes, those are the violations of human laws, and sins are violations of God's law. So, I mean, that's one definition that people will offer. Criminals typically act the way they do, right? Because they reject the authority of humans. And that authority is reflected in our human laws. In a similar way, people who deny the existence of sin typically do so because they reject the authority of God. So to say there's no sin is kind of the equivalent of saying there's no God. Is that what you're saying? Is that why you say there's no sin? Because what you're really saying is there's no God. If God does exist, sin exists, based on these two definitions we just offered, right? I mean, sins are basically just acts that, for the most part, reflect our, at least compared to God, our imperfect nature. We sin, God doesn't sin, He's morally perfect. We don't, we miss the mark, and so we are, comparatively at least, imperfect. And all the sin word does is describe those imperfections. Now, so let's get right to the chase. The issue isn't really whether you deny the existence of sin. The issue is, if you look at these two definitions, most people think of sin as the violation against God. So what you're really saying is that God doesn't exist. Can you tell me why you reject the existence of God? Forget about sin for a second, because I think that's what you're really saying here. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to drive the conversation in the area where I think it really lies. And most of the time, because sin is associated with God's holy laws and the problem we have standing before God. Crimes are the problems we have standing before each other. Sins are the problems we have standing before God. And for a lot of people, that's really how they define the terms. I think we're going to have to spend some time helping them to talk about the evidence for God. Now this is a whole different conversation, right? And we've talked about so much of this in prior episodes. I think we've done like 120 episodes of this show. The TV show. Forget about this 8 years of podcasts we did before this TV show. And we've got how many articles online? We have an entire section on evidence for God's existence in just the article section. We've got an entire section now, by the way, we just redid this, so that our website now has got not just categories for the articles, but all of the videos are now in categories. All of the podcasts are now in categories. So it makes it easier for you to review the evidence for God's existence. Now, it's a much larger conversation. And I think for purposes of this kind of interaction with somebody, I don't think you have to even go there. Just let them unpack why they don't believe God exists. Because when you reject sin, most people are really covertly saying, I don't believe there's a God. And that's the conversation I want to have. Because if there is a God, then you have to deal with this problem we have standing before God. Look, if God is what we think He is, by definition, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving. Well, the all-powerful part's what's scary, right? From a sin perspective, because if God is all-powerful, He has the power to eliminate moral imperfection. And now you realize then that the environment in which God abides, if we're going to call that heaven, is morally perfect. That means the kinds of creatures that can exist in that morally perfect environment must also be morally perfect. You got good days and bad days just like me. I've never had a perfect day. I can't even get a perfect 10 minutes. And that means I have a sin problem. If for no other reason, it's because compared to God, I have moral imperfections. I think most of us would agree. If there's a God who's all-powerful, we're not stuck with a good God. I wish it was that easy. That means that God is a morally perfect God. And that is much more difficult, because that means we'd have to be morally perfect to be in the same environment, to be face to face. And that is the problem we're trying to solve. And that's why the perfection of Jesus, I still struggle with perfection. I'm not one of those people who believes you can become morally perfect after becoming a Christian. I still have my good days and bad days. But what I hope is, and I trust in what Jesus did on the cross, I don't hope, I know. I know this because 1 John tells me I can know now that I am positionally perfect, even though I am practically imperfect. That is the trust we have based on the evidence of Scripture, based on the evidence of history, based on the evidence for Christianity. We have not just a blind hope, a blind wish, a wishful thinking. No, we actually can trust that something is true, that we can adopt the positional perfection of Jesus. God looks at us and sees Jesus and His moral perfection, the one morally perfect being. He doesn't see us in the mess we are. So I think this is what this answer tries to do here, is to leverage this notion, this idea that they're saying there is no sin, what they probably mean is there is no God. Let's have that conversation with people. I think that is a more productive conversation. We'll take a break, come back. I'll give you a final way to respond to the objection that there is no such thing as sin. Right. Well, I think as Christians, we all believe there are two kind of powers, but not equal powers, but there are two powers we commonly think of in Scripture, for good and for evil. And one of those is, of course, God, Yahweh, and the other is Satan. So we kind of accept this view. The question, of course, is did that make sense to me as an atheist? I think what I would have agreed as an atheist, I would have given you a first step at least. I would have said, look, I don't think that evil is a thing. I think it's the absence of something. So it's kind of the shadow to the light has always been the comparison that is made. That without the light, you can't have the shadow. And the shadow is simply the absence of light in that area. So what we think of as evil is really the absence of something. But that requires the something to be there so that you can have the absence of it. So the something proves the absence, but it doesn't work the other way around, right, in life. So this is why we would say, the best analogy we have for this is that God is not creating this something we call evil. That evil is instead the absence of goodness. And a lot of that can be accounted for even in our own free choices that we make. We often choose against what God would put up for us as the source of, as a model for good. We often choose to do something we shouldn't do. Think about this for a second. If there's a loving God, and if love is one of those, the nature of the world that we have to consider, like, for example, we talked about eternity. If the world is really, if we really live eternal lives, that changes everything. Well, if God is really a God of love, you have to think about what that would entail. In order for there to be love, you have to have the freedom to choose love. Otherwise, it's coercion.
There's no love in a world where there's no choices. If you have no choice but to love, you're not really loving. You're just doing the robot thing that you have no choice to do. So if we think love is a high priority, and I think the God of the Scripture is the God of love. Look, read 1 John. I mean, you're going to be stuck with this version of God, which we love, right? We think it's so great. That God is love. Okay. If that's the case, then what is the thing you have to put in place first in order to secure a universe in which love could exist? You have to secure first free agency. So it turns out if love is your goal, it's not the foundation. Free agency is the foundation upon which love stands. That's the problem, though. That's a scary world. Because if you're going to give people the freedom to love, you have to also give them the freedom to hate. The freedom to do the opposite of what you've commanded. Now, it would be a terrible world if you gave people freedom but no guidelines. Here's a gun, I'm not even going to show you. Here's a knife, I'm going to throw it at you. I'm not even going to tell you how to catch it. That would be a terrible world. That's not what God has done. He's actually given us the freedom to choose, but given us very strict guidelines so we won't abuse our freedom. Now, what we typically do is we choose to ignore his guidelines and make choices that are not the choices he would make, and then we kind of shake our fist at God. Well, a loving God gives you the freedom and guidelines, and that's exactly what we see in the Christian worldview. A loving God who gives us freedom and guidelines. And then we, of course, abuse those guidelines, and that's not really, we can't shake our fist at God when that happens. We've got to point to the person who's really at fault, which is our own choices. So much evil we see in the world, not all, but much of the evil we see in the world, I think, is because we have a foundation which God lays in place first of free agency, and we simply abuse it. Okay, I just included this third response, even though I think the third response is much like the second response, but I just wanted to kind of give you a more forward-leaning version of response 2. Because we've already covered the idea that to claim there's no sin is really a claim that there's no God. So I just want to, what if you're listening to this person and they admit that, yeah, that's really the issue for them, there's no God. Well, is there a thumbnail sketch of the evidence you could provide for God's existence that might at least advance the cause of your conversation? So I wanted to give you that in this third response. Take a look at it on the screen right now. Okay, so here I want to give you just the common textbook definition. You say there's no sin. Okay, I get it. The question I have is, let's just look at what usually is considered to be the common definition of this word sin. This is just from an online source, right? It's this idea that sin is an immoral act that's considered to be a transgression against divine law. That is a very common definition of sin online. You'll see that in many dictionaries. In other words, sin is an act that offends God. So to say that there is no such thing as sin is, as we said before, the equivalent of saying there is no such thing as God. But there are actually good reasons to believe there is a God, I think. And I think it starts with the macro, and it works all the way down to our experience as humans. It starts with the evidence that I see in the universe, and it works its way all down to the microscopic level of life here on Earth. I mean, we got a fine-tuned universe, right? That it came into existence from nothing. The idea that the universe is fine-tuned for life is non-controversial, folks. It is. It's this idea that we're trying to explain the fine-tuning, and many people will try to explain it without a fine-tuner. I get that. But the idea that the universe appears to be fine-tuned for life is not that controversial. And the idea that the universe came into existence from nothing, which means whatever caused it is outside of space, time, and matter, that's actually not all that controversial. You know, I mean, worse than that, though, how do you explain the origin of life without God? How do you explain the information we see in DNA, which really is the catalyst for so much biology? I mean, information always comes from intelligence. You can't get information from raw physics acting on matter. There's no example of that anywhere in the history of the universe. Look, there are good reasons to believe that God exists, from the immense scale of the universe to the microscopic scale of biology. And that's, you know, if there's good reason to believe that God exists, then there are good reasons to believe that sin exists, just based on the textbook definition of what sin is. Would you be interested in knowing more about why I believe that God exists?
Because that would, I think, lead us to a conclusion about whether or not sin exists. Would you like to hear why I think in detail God exists? Okay, again, what we've done here is we pivoted from the objection towards sin to the objection toward God's existence by connecting the definition of sin to God's existence, which makes sense, right? Now, I will tell you, this requires you to have enough information to be able to have that secondary conversation. I'm guessing if you're watching this show or listening to this podcast, you're probably already interested in learning how to make that case. All I'm suggesting to you, if you're somebody who has had an interest in Christian case making, also known as apologetics, and you've looked at a lot of detail, looked at a lot of history for the reliability of the New Testament, you looked at some of the scientific, philosophical, biological, mental, all the evidence for God's existence, you're probably already starting to learn that. If you haven't, if you just stumbled upon this show for the first time, well, then now is the time to be able to make that case. But what I love about people who pick podcasts to listen to, the same way you've picked this podcast or this television show to watch, is that we do this because we have an interest there already, right? We watch the shows we're interested in, duh. So all I'm suggesting here is that you probably already have an interest in some of those other areas of evidence for God's existence. Now just leverage that interest and that stuff you've learned toward this issue of there is no sin. Because remember, this is simply a claim against the existence of God. And we actually have something to say about that. I think we've got good reason to believe that God exists. To give you an opportunity to exercise some of the information, some of the stuff you've already learned. And that's what we're trying to do here. Look, I think that these terms are at times confusing for non-Christians. They seem almost parochial or archaic. The idea of sin. I've written an article online on the website that just talks about the number of expressions we use, which we call Christianese, that make the problem more difficult. And so I actually think I would probably not use that term. I would simply talk about what we all sense is our own moral failing. All of us, I think, would recognize we are not morally perfect beings. If there is a morally perfect being who has designed us to be in communion with Him, we'd have to solve this problem. And that's what Christianity does. Anyway, I hope this kind of helps you to think through some basic steps as you try to answer this objection that there is no sin. Remember, it is tied to a larger objection that there is no God. And I'll join you back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.